The Lost Battalion of World War I endured one of the most horrific examples of military abandonment, where 500 American soldiers were trapped in the Argonne Forest and systematically destroyed by German forces while their own artillery accidentally shelled their position, creating a nightmare scenario where death came from all directions. Major Charles Whittlesey's battalion was cut off from supply lines and surrounded by German troops who spent days slowly picking off the isolated Americans while denying them food, water, and medical supplies. The soldiers were forced to drink from shell craters filled with contaminated rainwater and blood, leading to dysentery that weakened them further while making their position detectable by the smell. German snipers made it impossible to tend to wounded men who lay screaming in no man's land for days until they died from blood loss or infection. The most disturbing aspect was how American artillery, unaware of the battalion's exact location, began shelling the area where their own men were trapped, killing additional soldiers with friendly fire that continued for hours despite desperate attempts to signal their position. Carrier pigeons sent to request help were shot down by German marksmen, and the famous bird Cher Ami arrived at headquarters with a bullet-shattered leg and a message written in blood. Of the original 500 men, only 194 survived the week-long ordeal, many so traumatized by watching their comrades die slowly that they never recovered mentally from the experience. Marilyn Monroe's death on August 4, 1962, involved circumstances so suspicious and contradictory that they suggest either a carefully orchestrated murder made to look like self-harm or a cover-up so extensive that the truth may never be known. The official autopsy found lethal levels of barbiturates in her system, but no residue in her stomach, indicating the drugs were administered through means other than oral ingestion, possibly via enema, which would suggest either unusual self-harm method or external administration. Her housekeeper's story changed multiple times, first claiming she discovered the body at midnight, then changing the time to 3 a.m., with no explanation for the 3-hour discrepancy during which unknown activities could have occurred. Phone records from Monroe's house mysteriously disappeared, and the ambulance service initially called to the scene reported finding Monroe alive but unconscious, contradicting later official accounts of her being dead upon discovery. Several witnesses reported seeing men leaving Monroe's house shortly before her death, including individuals connected to the Kennedy family and organized crime figures, who had obvious motives for silencing the actress. The most disturbing aspect is how quickly the investigation was shut down, with evidence destroyed and witnesses intimidated into silence, suggesting a conspiracy involving law enforcement officials willing to cover up a potential murder to protect powerful individuals whose reputations depended on Monroe's permanent silence about her alleged affairs with President Kennedy and his brother Robert. The Tuskegee Airmen faced a horrific double threat during World War II. Not only did they risk death in aerial combat against German fighters, but they also faced systematic attempts by their own military to ensure their failure and potential death through inadequate training, inferior equipment, and deliberately dangerous missions. These African-American pilots were given older, poorly maintained aircraft, while white units received newer, more reliable planes, essentially sending black aviators into battle with equipment designed to fail. Training was deliberately limited, with many Tuskegee pilots receiving less flight time than their white counterparts before being sent into combat zones where inexperience meant death. Perhaps most disturbing was how military leadership actively hoped for high casualty rates among black pilots to justify their racist beliefs about African Americans' inability to serve in combat roles. When Tuskegee pilots were shot down, rescue efforts were often delayed or abandoned entirely, leaving them to die in enemy territory or spend war years in German prison camps where they faced additional persecution as both Americans and African Americans. Ground crews were often sabotaged their aircraft, loosening bolts or tampering with engines in ways that would cause mechanical failure during flight. The psychological toll was devastating. These men fought two wars simultaneously, knowing that many of their fellow Americans wanted them to die just as much as the enemy did, turning every mission into a test of survival against multiple forces determined to destroy them. Native American folklore describes ghost wolves as spectral guardians that appear to warn of impending death or protect sacred territories, but these encounters are often described in terms that suggest something far more sinister than benevolent protection. According to tribal legends, ghost wolves appear as translucent white figures that move without making sound, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light that causes immediate terror in both humans and animals. Unlike living wolves, these spirits show no fear of humans and will approach people directly, often circling them while emitting low growls that seem to come from inside the observer's head rather than from the creature itself. Encounters with ghost wolves are said to predict death within the family or tribe, but the warning comes with a terrible cost. Those who see the ghost wolves often develop an obsessive compulsion to follow them into the wilderness, never to return. Some accounts describe the ghost wolves as the spirits of wolves killed unjustly, seeking revenge by luring humans to their deaths in remote locations where their bodies will never be found. The most disturbing aspect of these legends is how they describe the ghost wolves' intelligence. They seem to understand human psychology and exploit people's natural curiosity about wildlife to lead them away from safety. Modern sightings continue to be reported in areas where wolves were historically exterminated, suggesting these legends persist because they address real psychological fears about humanity's relationship with the natural world. Victorian post-mortem photography created a disturbing industry where families posed deceased loved ones as if they were still alive, often achieving such realistic results that modern viewers cannot distinguish between the living and dead subjects in old family portraits. These photographs were frequently the only images ever taken of deceased family members, particularly children, leading to elaborate staging where corpses were propped up with hidden supports, their eyes painted open, or glass eyes inserted to create the illusion of life. Professional post-mortem photographers developed techniques for positioning bodies to hide signs of death, using cosmetics to restore color to pallid skin, and wire frameworks to hold limbs in natural positions. The most disturbing images show deceased children positioned among living family members, creating group portraits where death and life are indistinguishable. Some photographers specialized in creating sleeping poses that were less obviously macabre but still captured the deceased for posterity. The practice was so common that families would rush to arrange these sessions before decomposition set in, sometimes holding bodies for days in cool rooms while waiting for the photographer to arrive. What makes Victorian death photography particularly unsettling is how normal it seemed to contemporary society. These images were displayed in homes, shared with friends, and treasured as precious mementos, revealing a culture far more comfortable with death's physical reality than modern society. In ancient Greek mythology, the Empusa represented one of the most terrifying supernatural entities, a shape-shifting demon that preyed on travelers by appearing as a beautiful woman before revealing her monstrous true form and devouring her victims. Unlike other mythological creatures, the Empusa was described as having one leg made of bronze and one made of donkey's flesh, creating an unnatural hybrid that could barely be classified as a single creature. She was said to serve Hecate, the goddess of magic, and crossroads, appearing most frequently at night to lure unsuspecting men with promises of sexual pleasure. Once her victims were isolated and vulnerable, the Empusa would transform into her true form, a creature with glowing eyes, bronze fangs, and the to drain life force through physical contact. What made the Empusa particularly disturbing was her intelligence and cunning. She could maintain her beautiful human disguise for extended periods, engaging in conversation and building trust before striking. Ancient accounts describe how she would sometimes torment victims psychologically before killing them, appearing in their dreams for weeks or months to drive them insane with desire and fear. The myth influenced later vampire legends, establishing the template for predators who use sexual attraction as a hunting mechanism. Her association with crossroads made travel dangerous, as any intersection could harbor this predator waiting for the next victim to wander into her trap. The 27 Club represents a disturbing pattern where exceptionally talented musicians die at age 27, often from substance abuse, creating a macabre mythology that suggests artistic brilliance and early death are somehow connected. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse all died at this exact age, leading to speculation about whether reaching 27 represents a dangerous psychological threshold for creative individuals. The deaths share common elements: intense fame achieved at a young age, substance abuse as a coping mechanism, and a lifestyle that prioritized artistic expression over physical health. What makes the 27 Club particularly disturbing is how it's romanticized in popular culture, with some young musicians viewing membership as a mark of authentic artistic credibility rather than a tragic waste of human potential. The club's mythology suggests that true artistic genius requires self-destruction, creating a dangerous narrative that encourages young performers to view substance abuse and reckless behavior as necessary components of creativity. Statistically, musicians are significantly more likely to die young than the general population, with drug overdoses, violence, and accidents claiming lives at rates that would be considered epidemic in any other profession. The most chilling aspect is how the music industry continues to exploit this pattern, marketing the tortured artist persona while providing little support for performers struggling with addiction and mental health issues. The Tuskegee syphilis study represents one of medical history's most horrific betrayals of trust, where U.S. Public Health Service researchers deliberately withheld life-saving treatment from African American men to study the natural progression of untreated syphilis. From 1932 to 1972, 399 men with syphilis and 201 control subjects were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood, never informed they had syphilis or that effective treatment existed. When penicillin was discovered as a cure for syphilis in the 1940s, researchers actively prevented participants from receiving treatment, even blocking them from accessing antibiotics through other medical providers. The study continued for decades while participants suffered through the disease's horrific later stages, including blindness, insanity, heart disease, and painful death. Researchers performed spinal taps without anesthesia, telling participants the painful procedure was free treatment while actually collecting data on neurological damage. Wives contracted syphilis from their husbands, and children were born with congenital syphilis, creating generational trauma that researchers documented as part of their study. The most disturbing aspect was how medical professionals justified this torture as scientific necessity, viewing the participants as subhuman test subjects rather than patients deserving care. The study only ended when a whistleblower leaked information to the press, revealing 4 decades of systematic medical murder disguised as research. The mummies of Guanajuato represent one of Mexico's most macabre tourist attractions, where naturally preserved corpses from a 19th century cholera epidemic are displayed in grotesque poses that capture their final moments of death. These bodies were exhumed from the local cemetery when families couldn't pay burial fees, only to discover that the area's unique soil composition and climate had naturally mummified the remains with disturbing perfection. The mummies retain facial expressions, hair, clothing, and even fingernails, creating a haunting gallery of death that shows visitors exactly what human decay looks like when artificially halted. Many of the bodies are contorted in positions that suggest they were buried alive during the cholera epidemic, a common occurrence when disease spread so rapidly that determining actual death was difficult. Some mummies appear to be screaming, their mouths frozen open in eternal terror, while others have their hands positioned as if trying to claw their way out of coffins. The smallest mummy is a fetus, likely extracted from its mother's womb after death, displayed alongside adults who died in various stages of the disease. What makes this display particularly disturbing is how it's marketed as entertainment rather than treated as a cemetery, with tourists taking selfies alongside human remains that represent one of Mexico's deadliest epidemics. The Zodiac Killer terrorized Northern California not just through murder, but through a calculated campaign of psychological torture that demonstrated a disturbing understanding of how to weaponize fear across an entire population. Between 1968 and 1969, the killer murdered at least 5 people while taunting police and media with cryptic letters that contained details only the murderer would know, creating a reign of terror that extended far beyond the actual victims. The killer's letters included hand-drawn crosshair symbols and boastful claims about his murder count. But most disturbing were the complex ciphers that seemed to contain his identity or future plans. Some of these codes remain unsolved today, meaning the killer's final messages remain locked away, possibly containing confessions to additional murders or clues to his identity. The psychological impact was amplified by the killer's ability to strike anywhere. His victims included couples on romantic dates, a cab driver, and a college student, creating paranoia throughout the Bay Area. What made the Zodiac particularly terrifying was his apparent intelligence and organizational skills, suggesting a methodical predator who planned each attack carefully while simultaneously orchestrating a media campaign designed to maximize public fear. The case remains unsolved, meaning somewhere a killer may have literally gotten away with the perfect crime, having successfully terrorized an entire region while leaving behind a puzzle that has baffled investigators for over 5 decades. Heath Ledger's death revealed the disturbing psychological toll that method acting can exact when an actor becomes too deeply immersed in dark character work. While preparing for his role as the Joker in The Dark Knight, Ledger reportedly locked himself in a hotel room for weeks, developing the character's mannerisms and psychological profile through intense isolation and sleep deprivation. He kept a diary filled with disturbing images and thoughts from the Joker's perspective, essentially programming his mind to think like a psychopathic killer. Friends reported that Ledger had difficulty separating himself from the character after filming Wrapped, often slipping into the Joker's speech patterns and exhibiting the character's unsettling mannerisms in private conversations. His insomnia became severe, leading to a dangerous dependence on prescription medications as he struggled to quiet his mind enough to sleep. On January 22, 2008, Ledger was found dead in his apartment from an accidental overdose of prescription drugs, including sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, and painkillers. The tragedy highlighted the dark side of method acting, where performers risk their mental health and sometimes their lives to inhabit psychologically dangerous characters. His posthumous performance as the Joker was universally acclaimed, but the cost was his life, raising questions about whether artistic brilliance is worth such devastating personal sacrifice. The Salem witch trials of 1692 created a legal system so corrupted by fear and superstition that it became a machine for producing state-sanctioned murder based on hallucinations and personal vendettas. The court accepted spectral evidence, claims that the accused's spirit had appeared in dreams or visions to commit evil acts, as legitimate proof of guilt, making defense virtually impossible since there was no way to disprove someone's supernatural claims. 20 people were executed based on this phantom evidence, including elderly women who confessed under torture, and a man who was slowly crushed to death with stones for refusing to enter a plea. Children as young as 4 were imprisoned and interrogated, with their confused responses to leading questions used as evidence against their parents. The trials created a community-wide psychosis where neighbors turned against each other, settling old grudges through accusations of witchcraft that carried a death sentence. Perhaps most disturbing was how the legal system completely abandoned due process. The accused were presumed guilty, forced to prove their innocence against unprovable charges, and often executed based solely on the hysterical testimony of young girls whose stories constantly changed. The trials only ended when accusations began targeting wealthy and influential citizens, revealing how the horror had been systematically directed at society's most vulnerable members while protecting the powerful. Many cultures maintain strict taboos against discussing death, creating a conspiracy of silence that leaves individuals psychologically unprepared for mortality's reality. These taboos often stem from superstitious beliefs that speaking about death will somehow invoke it, leading to communities where people suffer and die without ever having processed or prepared for the experience. In some cultures, even mentioning death in casual conversation is believed to curse the speaker or listeners, creating an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety around an inevitable biological process. This cultural suppression often results in traumatic experiences when death does occur, as family members have no framework for processing grief or making end-of-life decisions. Children in these cultures grow up with a pathological fear of death because it's treated as an unspeakable horror rather than a natural process. The taboo extends to practical matters. People avoid writing wills, discussing funeral preferences, or making medical directives because acknowledging death's possibility is culturally forbidden. When death does arrive, families are often completely unprepared, leading to conflicts, inappropriate medical interventions, and complicated grief. The most disturbing aspect is how these taboos create a cycle where each generation passes on their terror and avoidance to the next, ensuring that death remains a source of unnecessary trauma and fear. Ancient civilizations, particularly Romans, created and wore phallic pendants as protective amulets against evil, but the archaeological context reveals disturbing insights into their beliefs about supernatural threats. These amulets were often worn by children, indicating that ancient peoples believed infants and young people were particularly vulnerable to malevolent forces that could only be repelled by explicit sexual imagery. The pendants were crafted with meticulous detail, sometimes incorporating additional disturbing elements like wings, animal features, or multiple appendages, suggesting the ancient world was populated by imaginary threats so terrifying that only the most potent symbols could provide protection. Archaeological evidence shows these amulets were sometimes found in graves, indicating people believed they needed supernatural protection even in death. The widespread use across multiple civilizations suggests a shared belief in invisible entities so malevolent that exposing them to phallic imagery would cause them to flee in disgust or fear. What makes this particularly unsettling is the implication that ancient peoples lived in constant fear of supernatural assault, requiring them to carry explicit protective charms at all times. The practice reveals a worldview where evil forces were so pervasive and persistent that even daily activities required magical protection through shocking imagery. In Irish folklore, the banshee represents one of the most chilling supernatural entities, a spectral woman whose mournful wail serves as an inescapable death omen for ancient Celtic families. According to centuries-old accounts, the banshee appears as a gaunt figure in tattered clothes, her long hair flowing as she combs it while releasing an otherworldly shriek that penetrates to the soul. Her appearance is said to be so disturbing that those who see her are marked for death within days, making the encounter both a prophecy and a curse. The banshee's wail is described as a sound so filled with grief and terror that it can drive listeners to madness, and she typically appears at night near rivers or ancient family graveyards. What makes the banshee particularly terrifying is her selectivity. She only appears to warn of deaths in families with ancient Irish bloodlines, suggesting a supernatural connection spanning generations. Witnesses describe her eyes as hollow sockets filled with centuries of sorrow, and her presence is often accompanied by sudden drops in temperature and the scent of decay. The most disturbing aspect is that her warning cannot be heeded or changed. She appears not to prevent death, but to announce its inevitability, making her encounters a preview of unavoidable doom. The Simathoa exigua, known as the tongue-eating louse, performs one of nature's most disturbing takeovers by literally replacing a fish's tongue with its own living body. This parasitic crustacean enters through the fish's gills and attaches to the tongue, systematically severing the blood vessels until the organ withers and dies from lack of circulation. As the original tongue atrophies and falls away, the parasite positions itself in the exact same location and functions as a replacement tongue, allowing the host fish to continue feeding normally. The host fish remains alive throughout this horrific process, essentially living with a parasite for a tongue for the rest of its life. The parasite feeds on blood and mucus from the host, while simultaneously helping the fish catch prey, creating a disturbing symbiotic relationship. What makes this even more unsettling is that the fish appears to suffer no ill effects from having a living creature permanently attached inside its mouth. Marine biologists have found that infected fish can live normal lifespans, meaning they spend years with this grotesque imposter serving as their primary feeding apparatus, completely unaware that their tongue is actually an alien life form. When natural disasters strike, wild animals face particularly horrific deaths that reveal nature's complete indifference to suffering. During earthquakes, countless animals are buried alive in collapsed burrows and caves, slowly suffocating in darkness while the earth continues to shift around them. Tsunamis create massive graveyards where marine and terrestrial animals are found miles inland, having been carried by the devastating waves before being crushed against buildings or buried under debris. Forest fires trap animals in expanding circles of flame, forcing them to choose between burning alive or suffocating from smoke inhalation. Floods create equally disturbing scenarios where animals desperately seek higher ground, often drowning from exhaustion after swimming for hours with no rescue in sight. The aftermath of hurricanes reveals trees filled with animal corpses that were impaled by flying debris or died from exposure after losing their shelters. Perhaps most disturbing is how predators often survive these disasters and prey upon weakened survivors, turning rescue into another form of death sentence. Unlike humans, animals have no early warning systems, no evacuation plans, and no understanding of why their world has suddenly become a death trap, making their deaths both inevitable and heartbreakingly senseless. Endometriosis represents one of medicine's most insidious conditions, where tissue similar to the uterine lining grows in places it should never exist, creating internal havoc that can destroy lives. In rare but documented cases, this rogue tissue has been found growing in the brain, lungs, eyes, and even on the skin, causing symptoms that baffle doctors and torment patients. When endometrial tissue grows in the brain, it can cause seizures that coincide with menstrual cycles, creating a nightmarish connection between reproductive function and neurological terror. Lung endometriosis can cause monthly episodes where patients literally cough up blood in sync with their periods, while ocular endometriosis can result in tears of blood during menstruation. The condition affects millions of women worldwide, yet diagnosis often takes 7 to 12 years as patients are dismissed or misdiagnosed. During this time, the misplaced tissue continues its destructive growth, forming adhesions that can fuse organs together and create chronic pain so severe that some patients describe it as feeling like their insides are being torn apart monthly. The psychological toll is equally devastating, as the invisible nature of the condition often leads to disbelief from others. In 2013, pop star Kesha made disturbing public claims that her body was inhabited by malevolent spirits, leading her to seek an exorcism through hypnotherapy. She described feeling possessed by entities that would control her actions and thoughts, creating a terrifying experience of losing autonomy over her own physical form. The singer reported that these supernatural inhabitants would manifest during performances and recordings, sometimes altering her voice or causing involuntary movements that she couldn't explain or control. Her accounts included descriptions of cold spots following her, unexplained bruises appearing on her body, and voices whispering threats and commands in her head during quiet moments. The experience was so disturbing that she underwent multiple spiritual cleansing sessions and worked with paranormal investigators to document the alleged activity. While skeptics attributed her experiences to psychological stress or publicity seeking, Kesha's genuine distress was evident in interviews where she appeared visibly shaken, discussing the incidents. Her case highlighted the intersection of mental health struggles and supernatural beliefs in celebrity culture, raising questions about whether fame's pressures can manifest in paranormal delusions, or if some experiences transcend conventional explanation. The public's morbid fascination with celebrity deaths reveals disturbing aspects of human psychology, transforming personal tragedies into entertainment spectacles. When David Bowie died in 2016, his passing generated more media coverage and public mourning than many humanitarian crises affecting thousands of lives. This phenomenon stems from parasocial relationships where fans develop one-sided emotional connections with celebrities, creating a false sense of intimacy that makes their deaths feel personally devastating. The media capitalizes on this obsession, providing exhaustive coverage of celebrity autopsy results, final moments, and conspiracy theories surrounding suspicious deaths. Social media amplifies this macabre interest, with death announcements becoming viral content and grief transformed into shareable posts. The most disturbing aspect is how celebrity deaths often overshadow more significant losses. A famous person's passing receives worldwide attention while countless unnamed victims of disasters or violence are forgotten. This cultural fixation reveals a society that values fame over human worth, turning mortality into a commodity for public consumption and reducing profound personal losses to trending hashtags and clickbait headlines. During the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, Allied forces deliberately targeted Japanese rescue vessels attempting to save survivors from sunken troop transports, resulting in approximately 1,000 deaths of shipwrecked sailors and soldiers. This controversial military decision transformed acts of mercy into legitimate military targets, as commanders argued that rescued enemy personnel would return to fight another day. The attack created a horrific scene where Japanese survivors, already struggling in oil-slicked waters, watched helplessly as their potential rescuers were strafed and sunk around them. Many survivors who had endured the initial sinking were forced to watch rescue boats explode in flames. Knowing their chances of survival had just evaporated, the incident highlighted the moral complexities of warfare, where traditional codes of maritime rescue were abandoned for strategic advantage. Allied pilots reported the psychological toll of firing on clearly marked medical vessels, but military necessity overruled humanitarian concerns. This battle marked a dark turning point where the rules of war were rewritten in blood, leaving survivors to face the ocean's merciless embrace. Makaja Big Harp and Wiley Little Harp terrorized the American frontier in the late 1790s, earning the grim distinction of being America's first documented serial killers. Operating across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, and Ohio, these brothers methodically murdered at least 39 people in a reign of terror that lasted several years. Their killing methods were particularly brutal. They would often torture victims before death, sometimes disemboweling them while still alive or crushing infants against trees. The brothers showed no discrimination in their targets, murdering men, women, children, and even their own offspring when the crying became inconvenient. Their motivations ranged from robbery to pure, sadistic pleasure, and they often mutilated bodies post-mortem. When Makaja was finally captured, he was decapitated, and his severed head was nailed to a tree as a warning. Wiley met a similar fate later, marking an early but effective chapter in frontier justice that demonstrated the brutal lengths communities would go to stop such monsters. On January 15, 1919, a catastrophic industrial disaster turned Boston's North End into a death trap when a massive molasses storage tank burst without warning. The rupture unleashed over 2 million gallons of thick, sticky molasses that formed a deadly wave, reaching 25 feet in height and traveling at 35 miles per hour through the crowded streets. 21 people died in the viscous flood, many drowning in the syrupy substance or being crushed by debris carried in the current. The molasses was so thick that rescue efforts were nearly impossible. Victims became trapped and suffocated in the sweet amber death. Emergency responders found themselves struggling through the sticky mess, unable to move quickly enough to save those calling for help. The disaster left 150 others injured, and the sickly sweet smell of molasses lingered in the neighborhood for decades, serving as a constant reminder of the day when an everyday ingredient became an agent of mass destruction.